Jonathan and I thought it would be fun to put together a video of something that I teach my students, which is some different ways to understand creation and a couple of different theories and ways that people interpret Genesis 1. So buckle up. This is there's six of them, but this is one of my favorite things actually that I get to teach and get to talk through. So I'm really excited to get to go through this content. So, the first thing that we want to remind ourselves is where Christians get this idea of creation in the first place. And it's from the Bible, it's from the very first book. And in fact, it's the very first chapter, Genesis chapter 1. And if you're not as familiar, Genesis chapter 1 is set up over the course of these 6 days. And over the course of these 6 days, God creates everything. And if you grew up in the church, you did the Sunday school thing right now, you are maybe racking your brain, going like, oh, I know somewhere in there God creates the sun. Like, does he create that first? And then at some point there's like birds. So I'm going to give you an easy way to remember the 6 days of Genesis 1, and then we'll talk about some of the different ways Christians have, over the course of time, interpreted those days. So, okay, last chance. Try and get it in your brain. What do you think the order was? 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest? All right, there they are. Yeah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It talks about the earth being formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the deep. And then it says, God said, let there be light. And there was light, and it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And so we get into this day by day by day pattern. So you can see day one talks about God creating light and dark. Day two talks about God creating seas and the sky, or the waters above the firmament or above the vault, and the waters beneath the vault. Day three, there's land that comes forth and plants that are growing on the land. On day four, God creates the sun and the moon and the stars, and he gives them a job, he says, to govern the times and the seasons. On day five, God creates birds and fish. And on day six, God creates all the other land animals, wild animals, livestock, and humans. And humans are like the pinnacle of creation. God creates mankind in his image. And then on day seven, he rests. All right, so here's how this is gonna help you. Here's how we're gonna remember it. If you look at day one, what does God create? He creates light, by extension, dark. Okay, and then you look right below it on day four, what does he create? The sun, the moon, and the stars, the things that we associate with light. Okay, on day two, God creates the seas and the sky. And then look right below it. What does God create on day five? Birds and fish, the things that live in the sea and the sky. Okay, and then on day three, God creates land and plants. What does he create on day six? Animals that live on the land, humans that live on the land. All right, so there's a little bit of a parallel going on. And we'll talk more about that as we get to some of our theories. But just to remind ourselves, like, this is the biblical account. This is the Genesis narrative. And it talks about God creating these things in this order. And so one of the questions we're going to be asking ourselves as we go through these different theories is, how does the theory reconcile God creating the world in this order? Because what might stand out to you, if you are maybe less familiar with the church, or you grew up outside of a Christian environment, or you've just like taken a science class or watched a science TV show, gone to a science museum, this is not the order that people outside of Christianity often associate with how life came to be on Earth and how all things were, um, you know, came out of or evolved over time. This is a different order of events. And so the different theories have to kind of account for that in how they explain this chapter. Now, one more thing I want to say before we get into the specific theories. I'm not a science teacher. Like, whenever I teach this to my students, I always start with that. I don't teach science. There are very, very smart people who teach science. And so I highly recommend that you go and search them out on the YouTubes to find out more about the scientific explanation of how things came to be. We're not actually concerned about that in this video. What we're looking at is, how do Christians interpret Genesis 1? And that necessarily is involved with science, because some Christians think that the two help interpret each other in different ways. But this is not primarily a science video. So I'm sorry if you're looking for a science video, go away. But if you're interested in what does the Bible say, how should Christians understand it? How can maybe we understand it better? Here we go. Okay. First view, and this is the one, again, if you've like grew up in the church, you're probably most familiar with this one. 6-day young earth creationism. 6-day young earth creationism. For each of these, we'll have major beliefs, and then we'll kind of try and talk them out. So 6-day young earth creationist, this is like Answers in Genesis, a number of different modern organizations and religious movements are really kind of founded around this belief system. They would say that the creation days of Genesis 1, day 1, light and dark, day 2, sea and sky, that framework we went through, they would say they were 6 literal 24-hour days, and that occurred somewhere between 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. So that's where you get the 6-day, because they would say each day is a literal 24-hour day, and the idea of a young Earth, that the Earth itself did not exist, let's say 13,000 years ago, and it was within the last 12,000 years that everything you see around you came into existence. Okay. So part of this understanding is that 2,300, 3,300 years before Jesus, the surface of the earth was radically rearranged by Noah's flood. And again, for those of you less familiar with the church and the Bible and Christian teaching, Genesis 1, God creates everything. A couple chapters later, Genesis 6, God decides to send this flood. And the text describes it as this massive global flood. And people who hold to this understanding of creation say, yes, it was literally a flood where water literally covered every surface of the earth, so much so that Noah in his ark with all the animals were floating above the highest mountains. And that flood uh, necessarily massively changed the earth. And so it changed the tectonic plates, it changed the pressure of the water. Again, I'm not a scientist, but they would say that event, that global flood event, accounts for anything that we see that makes it look like the earth isn't as young as the Bible says that it is. Global flood. So, as a result, all land animals and birds not in Noah's Ark, along with many sea creatures, perished, and many of which were subsequently buried in the flood sediments. And so, when you go and you see fossils and you learn about all the different layers, people say, yeah, that didn't happen over the course of billions of years. That happened all at once, global flood. So, one of the ways I think is helpful to think about each of these theories is to kind of ask yourself, and that gets back to my little picture here, how did this group understand the dinosaurs? If you can kind of keep that in mind, it'll help you keep each one straight. So in this group, they would say, yeah, dinosaurs existed. They were created on day 6 with humans. They coexisted until the flood. And they were like getting along with humans until Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Go ahead and read that story in Genesis 3 if you're not familiar. So, like, Adam and Eve were like friends with dinosaurs, and then because of the fall, changed the nature of the relationship. So now dinosaurs are like kind of scary. But nevertheless, like, dinosaurs existed. Some creationists would say that dinosaurs were not on the ark, and that's when they went extinct. Other creationists would say that actually dinosaurs were on the ark, but that like Noah took baby dinosaurs, or he took eggs of dinosaurs, and that after the flood, the atmosphere changed, and so dinosaurs weren't able to live anymore, and that was kind of their major extinction event. Some 6-day young earth creationists, and this is actually where I kind of was when I was a younger person, so I have a lot of love in my heart for this perspective. They would say dinosaurs never actually went extinct, and that like in medieval paintings and things where they're fighting dragons, maybe it was actually dinosaurs. Loch Ness monster, maybe it's really a dinosaur. Anyway, I just throwing that out there. Um, that's what the fossils are, though. Fossils come from Noah's flood. Like I said, therefore, global catastrophic flood is responsible for most, if but not all, but most of the rock layers and fossils and all the carbon dating. So anybody that's saying the Earth is older than 12,000 years, they can't possibly know that because they're not taking into account major global flood. Okay. Um, why is this a good argument? Each of these theories have something going for them. And here's what I think 6-day young Earth creationists have for them. Genesis is just read as a history. It is kind of the most simple and straightforward way to attack the text. And Jesus, when he's teaching in the New Testament, he talks about people in Genesis, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, and he is talking about them as if their history is as they happened, the way the story seems to suggest that they happened. So if the New Testament, and Jesus especially, is talking about these events as if they happened the way they are described as happening, as Christians, that should count quite a bit for us. And so I think it does. Likewise, Exodus 20, verse 11, which is part of the Ten Commandments, God's telling the people, commandment number 4, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Why? Because God created on 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. And so, again, like we always want to use the Bible to interpret the Bible. And so, in this text over here in Exodus 20, it sounds like God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. As humans, we're supposed to follow that pattern. So, it must have been 6 literal days. Okay. If you're wondering where the young Earth part came from, like why 6,000 to 12,000 years, it's one way to read the genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. And pretty much everybody agrees Abraham lived somewhere around 2000 BC. Like that's where he fits into the timeline of overall human history. And so if you have a genealogy that goes back from Abraham to Adam, you can kind of do some genealogical math. Now there are reasons not to read the genealogies that way. But Six-Day Young Earth creationists would read them that way, and it is a way to read them, and there you have kind of the timing for that. And then yeah, I mean, for a really long time in church history, it was kind of taken for granted that the Genesis narrative told the story of how God created the world. Okay. So it's not universal, right? There's different discussions on that. But for a long time, there was no reason to question it. And a lot of different religions and cultures have their own creation myths and creation stories. And this was, Judaism and Christianity's. And so there's something to be said about the fact that a lot of people over the course of time have kind of assumed that Genesis 1 is meant to be read as straightforward. So why not continue to read it that way? All right, there are some arguments for. However, each of these theories also have arguments that do not go in their favor. Um, Here are some of the arguments against Six-Day Young Earth creationism. If we go back to our little framework here, um, it's problematic for a couple of reasons. Day 4 is when God creates the sun, moon, and stars. How do we know how long a 24-hour day is? Well, it's because that's the amount of time it takes for the Earth to turn and in relation to the sun. Okay. However, if God isn't even creating until the sun on day 4, for what reason would we say the first 3 days are 6 literal or 3 literal 24-hour days? Right? Like there's no sun to govern the time, so who's to say that the first 3 days should be 24 hours long? Um, I think that's probably the biggest issue. It's one of the issues. Another issue with Six-Day Young Earth creationism is the creation of humans. So God gets into the details of creating humans in Genesis 2. Go read it for yourself, where he talks about creating Adam from the dust and Eve from his rib. But that recreation story under this idea is all happening on day 6. Because in Genesis 1, God creates Adam and Eve. He creates male and female in his image. And then in Genesis 2, it goes into detail how God created Adam and then Eve. And so that's happening on day 6. The problem is, but before God creates Eve, after he creates Adam in Genesis 2, there's this back and forth where God is like, it's not good for man to be alone. No suitable helper is found. God brings all the animals on this like parade in front of Adam, and Adam names all of the animals. And then God creates Eve. So the idea is that all of that is happening on day 6, which means that like unless Adam is like tiger, lion, bear, amoeba, grasshopper, like, like literally just like naming every single animal super, super, super fast. I mean, that's a lot to have happen in a literal 24-hour day before Eve even gets created. So those are just two of the issues within the text itself. Again, I'm not a scientist. This particular view also does disagree with a lot of what modern science is saying about things like the age of the Earth, things like the progression of different species of animals and life forms. So there's a number of issues there. Um, but I think the issue itself that between the sun not existing until day 4, and that's a very long day, day 6 for Adam. I don't think you even really need to bring, modern scientific evolutionary theory into the conversation to say there are some challenges with 6 day young Earth creationism. Likewise, this idea of reading the genealogies to come up with a young Earth um, has not been the way that most of church history has read that text. That was something that came about more in the last 300 years. And so, while there has been kind of a assumption that, well, yeah, sure, if Genesis says it, that's how it happened, the idea of coming up with a exact date and saying, well, it must have been within this young Earth category of time, that's actually a pretty recent thing. And so that is also a weakness in this particular perspective. But hey, jump on in the comments. Do you see any other arguments against 6 day young Earth creationism? Okay, so to summarize, first view, 6 day young Earth, God created everything in 6 literal 24-hour days, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 years ago. The global flood accounts for any disagreement with modern science. And what do we do about the dinosaurs? They existed alongside humans. They went extinct after the flood, or did they? Okay, second, young Earth creation theory. This one is called apparent age or the appearance of age. And I will be candid, it is my pet personal favorite. I won't say that it's the one that I believe to be true, but I just find it fabulous and fascinating. And it has to do with this idea of fossils. So here's what they believe. God created a universe with an apparent history that was complete with accurate data, including non-essential apparent age, about what would have happened since the beginning, even though it never happened. That was a little confusing. Here's another way of putting it. God created the universe 6,000 years ago. So if you could get a time machine and you could get a video camera and you could boop, 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 go back 6,000 years ago, you would see nothing. And then you would see over the course of 6 days, boom, the whole world would be created, just like the Bible says. However, if you then took that video camera and you zoomed in and you looked at like a tree, for example, you could cut the tree down and the tree would have rings. So even though that tree, you could watch the video back, doesn't exist, doesn't exist, bing, it exists. You cut the tree open and it has rings as if it had been around for 500 years. Okay. Uh, Not just trees, but everything on Earth. If you look at it closely, if you study it scientifically, it looks as though it's billions of years old. But actually, God created it with that built-in age. Okay, I just love it so much. Here are some really good arguments for why people might believe this. Um, First of all, the text suggests that this happened, at least on a small scale. Okay. If you think about, the picture of God calling the animals into being, it's not that he's, what came first, the chicken or the egg. God's not creating a bunch of eggs. He's creating chickens and lizards and cats and dogs and all these other things. Think about Adam and Eve. God creates man and woman on day 6. He's not creating babies. He's not creating embryos. He's creating a man and a woman with an apparent age, even though there was a moment they didn't exist, and then boom, they do exist. So if God's already doing that with the animals, with the plants, again, it doesn't say like God created seeds. It says God created plants, right? The earth brought forth plants, fully mature plants, even though technically they were only alive for a few seconds. Uh, if that's happening already in the text, why not extend it out and say that's just how God created everything? All right, another reason that this might be the case is if you think about Jesus in the New Testament and the first miracle that he does, it says, I'm quoting here, a miracle produces apparent age as a part of a surprise in the sequence of natural cause-effect relationships. For example, the first miracle of Jesus recorded in John 2, 1 through 11 was turning water into wine at a wedding, right? The wedding at Cana. The wine was recently created and thus was young, but guests would have concluded it was old with an apparent history of grapes fermenting into wine, which requires time. Because think about it, how do you make wine? Well, you take grapes, you make grape juice, and they have to let it ferment. And it takes time. And a lot of people would say that like the longer wine is around, an older wine is going to taste even better. And at the wedding at Cana, what do the wedding guests say? The master of ceremony says, "This is the best wine," right? So it was an old wine. But had that wine actually been fermenting from grape juice all that time? No, Jesus made it in an instant, as if it had been fermenting for all that time. So we see Jesus performing that kind of miracle as his first miracle. Why wouldn't God do that when he's initially creating the world? Okay, I just really love that theory. It's not perfect though. There are arguments against it. Um, the the biggest one is really the fact that it makes God seem a little deceptive, right? Why would God create a universe, create a world that appears as though it's billions of years old, but have it not actually be billions of years old? Like, to what end? Doesn't that seem to call into question God's character? Because, so if we're thinking about how does this relate to dinosaurs, that's how you're going to remember these. In this theory, dinosaurs never actually walked the earth. Dinosaurs never actually lived. They have only ever existed as fossils, stuck in the layers of the earth, as like little surprises for us to find. And that is a little troublesome, I guess, right? Because in all this work that we're doing to try and figure out, like, what might dinosaurs have looked like they never actually lived. They were just fossils planted in the earth all this time. So that's the big issue with it. Parent age, young Earth. Here's the summary. God created everything 6,000-ish years ago, but it looks like it's billions of years old because he created it to look that way. So what happened with the dinosaurs? They were never actually alive. They've always only been fossils. Okay. Next theory. Now we're getting into those were the two young Earth creationist theories. The idea that even though some in modern science would say that the Earth is really old, if you're going to believe the Bible, it's actually young. Remember, young Earth, sixth day would say because of the flood. Appearance of age would say God made it to look old, even though it's not. These next two theories say actually we should interpret Genesis 1 with the understanding that the Earth is billions of years old. So any scientific discovery that tells us that the Earth has been around for that long, we can interpret Genesis 1 and hold that scientific finding to also be true. We don't have to separate them. So the first one, and if you grew up in the church, this is probably another one that you're familiar with, is this idea of day, age, old Earth creationism. So what do they believe? So we're talking about these days, these 6 days, and people in this camp would say, yeah, the days of Genesis 1 are not literal 24-hour days. In the other two theories, they were literal 24-hour days. You could go back, start a clock, beep, evening and morning, evening and morning, evening and morning, literal 24-hour days. With this theory, no. A day in Genesis 1 is actually a period of indefinite length, so that neither the age of the earth nor the duration of any particular period in creation history can be determined from the Bible. So when it says day, could have been a day, could have been 1,000 years, could have been a million years, could have been a billion years, because the word day is not being used to mean like calendar day, it's being used to mean something else. Where does that come from? Well, the basis for this view is that the Hebrew word yom for day can also mean an indefinite period of time. And the thing is that this is true for English also. So, for example, if you've ever heard an older person say something like, back in my day, kids weren't so connected to their phones, is that person talking about literally a day in time that was 24 hours long? No, when someone says back in my day, they're talking about like their season of life or an era of time. And so Hebrew can do the same thing. Um, Major kinds of plants and animals were created separately over eons of Earth's history, and the fossil record shows reliably which came earlier and which came later. So they would say that for the most part, and here we're going to click all the way back here, when we're looking at this framework, day one, light and dark, sure, but that day one could have lasted billions of years. Day two, separating the waters from the waters, that day could have lasted billions of years. Day three, land and plants. There's another perhaps billion years where it's just land and plants. Day four, sun, moon, stars, astronomical things. Give it another billion years where those things are being created. Day five, birds and fish and things that swim and things that fly. Give it another million years, whatever the case is, because each day is not a literal 24-hour day. It's a span of time, however long that span of time needs to be to accommodate modern scientific findings about these things being created. All right, sorry, clicking back here. Um, sometimes it's also called progressive creationism. And this has been a pretty popular theory among Christians for recent history. Here's some arguments for it. Okay. It allows for the commonly accepted scientific understanding of the age of the earth. So when Christians talk about like conflicts between Christianity and science, and they're specifically thinking about Genesis, usually it's in a couple of different camps. One of them is this idea of the age of the earth. Is the earth young or old? And that kind of gets to the Big Bang, right? If you've ever heard Christians talk about the Big Bang, they usually do so with a little bit of disdain, which is funny because actually before the Big Bang theory, the prevailing like non-Christian scientific notion was that the Earth itself, the material itself, was like eternal, the eternity of matter, and that things just always had been. And so it was actually a Belgian Catholic who came up with this idea that like, no, there was a time before the universe as we know it now existed. And if anything, like it brought that kind of creation, right? God speaking and things coming into being. Um, I think it lines up more with the Bible than people today often talk about it, but that's neither here nor there. So Big Bang, age of the earth. But you also see people in conflict over things like evolution, specifically evolution of humanity. And so this perspective, day age old Earth creationism, allows for the age of the Earth to be billions of years old, while still allowing for this progressive creation. So you don't need to agree with evolutionary theory, but you can agree with the fact that the Earth is billions of years old. Like we said, it works with the Hebrew word yom, and it kind of seems to work with the way the days are laid out. And it gives an opportunity for the fossil record to remain unchallenged, like we said, as well as this special creation of humanity in God's image, not having to have evolutionary theory be the connecting link. A lot of things for it. Arguments against it. Well, as much as the Bible also says, like, for the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day, like, that's true. God's time is different than our time. In Genesis, it does seem to suggest, and there was evening and there was morning for each of these days. And so to take the Hebrew word yom and have it mean something other than a 24-hour day, okay, but then what do you do with the evening and the morning? That's a challenge. That's a challenge for this view. Also, as much as it wants to line up with the fossil record, it just doesn't quite, because if you look at how modern evolutionary science suggests some of these animals came to be, layers of the earth, again, I'm not a scientist, but there's this idea that there were like land animals alive before like whales. And so are whales then not part of the day five era? Or is there like mixing of eras? It's not a one-to-one. It's not a perfect lineup. And so that's also a challenge with this particular view. Again, if you have any others, link them in the comments. Would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, here's a summary. Day, age, old Earth. God created everything progressively over the course of billions of years, or however long. What do we do with the dinosaurs? They existed. They existed a long time before humans, just like the fossil record shows. So another challenge with this one is what do you do with the fall? You have to allow for you have to allow for animal death before the fall, whereas young Earth creationism, both 6 day young Earth creationism and apparent age young Earth creationism, can say that there was no animal death before the fall. This one you have to allow for animal death before the fall, which again I don't find to be a particular interpretive challenge, but that might be a weakness in this view if you feel strongly about that. Okay. Then another lesser known, but also fascinating theory on interpreting Genesis 1, and this is called the gap theory. The gap theory. So here's what they believe. They would say there is a gap of untold length, billions of years perhaps, between the beginning of Genesis 1:1 and the first day of creation, starting with Genesis 1:3. And so, like we said, in the Bible, it talks about how in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and void. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the deep. And so it's like, that's a weird little interjection there. Like, what's going on there? People in this camp would say, yeah, that's a gap. There is this gap where God created the world initially, and then something happened, and then God recreated the world, starting with God said, let there be light. Okay, verse 1 refers to the original creation of the earth and the universe in the beginning, not the world that we see it now. There was this initial pre-creation creation. And so the fossils of things like dinosaurs and stuff like that, that's all what was in the original creation. And current living creatures come from this second creation after the gap, when God made them in 6 literal days, 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. All right, why would anyone want to believe this view? Again, it allows for the commonly accepted scientific understanding of the age of the Earth and the fossil record. Someone says the Earth is billions of years old. Sure it is. The gap was billions of years long. Fossils seem to suggest that dinosaurs and humans never interacted. Absolutely, because dinosaurs are part of the gap and humans were created after the gap. And again, it's because there's like this weirdness in the text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This also allows for things like creation of angels and demons, Satan falling from heaven. Uh, we don't have a real clear timeline on that from anywhere else in the biblical text. We have kind of references to it in Isaiah and Ezekiel, and then Jesus himself and in Revelation. And so the gap theory provides a time for that. When were angels created, and when did Satan rebel against God, and when that happened during the gap? Okay, and then God created the world as we see it now. Also, there is precedent for God doing this because he, in a lot of ways, kind of has this second creation narrative after the flood. There's a lot of parallels in Genesis 9 and Genesis 1, and we see Noah as this like second Adam figure. And so this idea that like God would destroy everything and start again, maybe he did it before the flood, maybe he did it during the gap. Um, Arguments against this. I mean, it's a lot of argument from silence, right? Like there it doesn't say that there was a gap. It's kind of this implication in the text that because that verse is kind of a little bit odd sounding, well, maybe there's this other whole thing that happened. But none of it's actually in the Bible as it's being laid out. So that's a challenge. Also, again, you deal with the animal death before the fall, if that's something that matters. And again, there's also that question, kind of like with appearance of age, if like, is God being deceptive somehow in hinting at this kind of stuff without actually telling us any of it? Um, it's a curiosity. It shouldn't come as any surprise this theory became kind of popular when dinosaur fossils were first being discovered. And they were starting to realize that like these giant, crazy, terrible, scary lizards must have once walked the earth. And it shouldn't be surprising that people were like, well, clearly they're like related to demons because they're really scary. And God wouldn't want that as part of like the goodness of creation. How could dinosaurs be good? And so they kind of put them away into this little category of like, well, they must have existed in the gap before things were good. And I think, that might be shortchanging dinosaurs, perhaps. So yeah, to summarize, gap theory, old Earth, God created a world and then recreated it. There's this gap in the first verses of Genesis 1. What do we do with the dinosaurs? They existed, did not coexist with man. They existed during the gap. All right. Now we're coming to two probably lesser, even more so known theories. This was called Days of Revelation, and I want to stop right there. I didn't name this, okay? I think it's confusing. This has nothing to do with the last book of the Bible. So the final book of the Bible is called Revelation. This is not referring to that. Instead, this is referring to the idea of this being revealed to Moses. But if you want to go do some like Google further researching, Days of Revelation is going to be your search term to help you find out about it. Okay, so these last two views we're going to talk about don't think that the Earth is necessarily young. They don't think that the Earth is necessarily old. They think Genesis 1 is doing something completely different. And again, this is getting back to how do we interpret Genesis 1, not necessarily how do we think God actually created things if you could go back with a video camera. Okay, so if we're going to think about this one, Days of Revelation, it views the 7 days of Genesis 1 not as 7 days of creation, but rather as 7 successive 24-hour days of revelation to Moses about God's act of creation. It views the phrase at the end of each section of the creation story that says, and there's evening and there's morning, as a scribal note recording what time of which day God gave each revelation. Okay, so you need a little bit of context in order to appreciate this view. So Moses, a lot of Christians believe, was the primary author of the first five books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You can read about Moses in the book of Exodus. That's kind of his biography story. And he's the one who, Prince of Egypt, Ten Commandments, let my people go. The people go through the Red Sea. And after the Red Sea, they get to Mount Sinai. The Bible talks about this again. You can read it in starting in Exodus chapter 19. They're there at the foot of the mountain, and God gives them the Ten Commandments. And the people are like freaking out because God's scary. And they say, Moses, don't have God talk to us anymore. You go up the mountain and you find out what he wants, and then you come back down and you tell us. And God's like, that's a good idea. And so it talks about how Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and he's gone for 40 days. And in fact, he's gone so long that the people at the foot of the mountain decide to build a golden calf. So what's Moses doing up there? Well, he's getting all of this information from God, and we have a lot of that information spelled out in the rest of Exodus and in Leviticus, because it's things like how to build the tabernacle, how to the priesthood, and all this kind of ceremonial stuff, as well as kind of further instruction on different rules that the Israelites were supposed to follow. And so there's this idea of like, well, Moses was up there for 40 days. That's a long time. Maybe God was also giving him some background information on how he should write Genesis. Moses didn't live through Genesis, so maybe God is like telling him how he should write all this stuff down. So a way to think about it is like Moses is on top of the mountain, okay? And like he's up there, and God's like, Moses, I'm going to tell you how I created the world. And Moses is like, that's awesome. And God says, um, let there be light. I said, let there be light, and there was light. And Moses is like, mind blown. And he just kind of like sits there for like a couple hours, just like contemplating that because it's like amazing. And then he falls asleep, and then he wakes up. Now it's the second day of God talking with Moses on the mountain. And God says, all right, Moses, get this. After I said, let there be light, I separated the waters above from the waters beneath. And Moses is like, wow, mind blown. And so again, there's like hours pass, and he's just contemplating and just like fellowshipping with the Lord and like praising him for the amazingness of sea and sky. And maybe he's considering the parting of the Red Sea. I don't know. And then he goes to sleep, and then he wakes up. And now we're on the third day of God talking to Moses. And God says, Moses, I brought forth land and plants. And Moses is like, oh, mind blown. And he's just like contemplating and meditating on the Lord. Okay, do you see what I'm saying though? Like each of those days, according to this view, it's not actually talking about, if you could go back with the video camera watching God create, it's you could go back with the video camera and watch God talk to Moses. And the Bible doesn't actually tell us how he created. Okay, arguments for this one. So, again, allows for the age of the earth, because Genesis 1 now is not even talking about when God actually created the world. Genesis 1 is just talking about God and Moses hanging out. Um, we know that God revealed a lot to Moses on Sinai. So why not this as well? Right? Why not? Why wouldn't God have also told Moses about the creation of the world? And this is a bonus. It allows for the evening and morning to be read literally without requiring the logical and scientific problems of young Earth creationism. So that's kind of a perk to this particular view. Um, Arguments against it. I mean, it's not clear from the text that that's what's happening. You would think that if that's what Moses was trying to communicate to us, he would have given us a little bit of more of a note of like, here's how God explained to me how the world was created, rather than kind of jumping back and forth with Genesis 1, and then clearly the rest of Genesis is meant to be kind of read as a story progressing, not as God talking to Moses. So I think there's a challenge there. My students always get hung up on this idea of like, why would Moses need a whole day to think about God saying, let there be light? And I always counter with, why would God need a whole day to create anything, actually? Right? If we're considering, old Earth creationism, young Earth creationism, God is God. He doesn't need a day to create light. He doesn't need a day to create the sun and the moon and the stars. He could create everything in just boom, everything's created, right? So I don't have a problem really with Moses being in awe of God's creation of light for a couple of hours, because what is time? How, God is outside of time. So that part doesn't bother me so much, but that might also be an argument against it. Why is Moses just sitting there in silence on the mountain thinking about light? Okay. So summary of this one. Days of Revelation. The days being described in Genesis 1 are not actually days of creation, but rather they are the days of revelation. It's the days of how God is telling Moses about the creation of the world. Um, so therefore, Genesis 1 is not actually telling us how God created the world, and we don't know how it really happened. And what do we do with dinosaurs? I mean, they existed, and we kind of follow the fossil record, and why not? Because the Bible isn't trying to tell us that. All right. Last but not least, framework hypothesis. I told you that framework on that early slide was going to come back. Here it is. Uh, there is, according to this view, this is significant. This view says the fact that there are these clear parallels tells us that there is something going on in Genesis 1 more than what meets the eye. And to just read it as a chronological narrative is actually to do it a disservice for what it is trying to show us. So, here's the major belief of the framework hypothesis. The days in Genesis are actually not describing literal chronological days. They are, in fact, literary devices employed by God in order to communicate the story of creation in terms that we can understand. So if you could go back with a time machine and a camcorder, you would not, according to this view, see God creating things over the course of 6 days. We don't know what it would look like. Maybe it would have taken millions of years. Maybe he did it all in an instant. We don't know, because that's not what Genesis 1 is trying to tell us. Genesis 1 isn't talking about chronological days. It's talking about a logical way of understanding the way creation works within itself and how it relates to God. All right. Why might someone believe this? What are some of the arguments for? Again, allows for commonly accepted scientific understanding of the age of the earth and the fossil record. Why not? Because the Bible isn't trying to tell us that. Now, again, it's not saying that we have to believe that. It's just that's not what the Bible is concerned with. Um, that framework, like that, there is a logic there. So whether or not it's like God created those things in that way chronologically in order for it to reflect a logical framework, or if he just had Moses write it in that way for us to see the logical framework, like you can't deny it that the logical framework is there, right? I mean, light, sun, sea, fish, sky, birds, land, animals, that's there. So whether God actually created it that way or God is just writing it that way for us to see it, there is a logic there. And what's interesting is it's not just that the day 1 and day 4 is parallel, day 2, day 5, day 3, day 6, but actually the first 3 days have something in common too. Those first 3 days are all domains or their kingdoms, or their kind of places, right? And then the second 3 days are the things that fill those places or have dominion over those domains or are kings over those kingdoms. And we see that with the sun, moon, and stars. Because even though we know that the sun is, not a living sentient being, when God creates the sun, moon, and stars, he gives them instruction. He says to govern the day and the night. And so there's that clue in the text itself that's telling us there's something going on here. And then, ending with humans being made in his image. Why? So that we can have dominion over the birds and the animals. Like there's this kingship language built into the creation narrative. Um, and to that last point there, the theological understanding behind the days of creation, it lines up with the rest of the Bible thematically more than just the suggestion that God must have created the world in 6 24-hour consecutive days. Like nowhere else really in the Bible do we get at God having to have done it that way. But this idea that like God created the world and he created things to bring order to the world and then he created things to govern and maintain and control and subdue and steward and profit the world, like that does line up with the rest of the text and the narrative that God is writing overall. Um, Arguments against this view. I mean, I like this view, so so it's hard for me to make a strong case against it. Here's the problems with it. Again, there's nowhere in the text that overtly tells us not to read it chronologically. And so you are kind of asking it to be interpreted in a way differently than we would interpret a lot of the rest of Genesis. And so it brings up this kind of question of like, okay, well, then at what point do you start reading Genesis literally as it literally happened? And so people who hold to this view, you have to make that decision of where you're going to kind of jump into the story and say, okay, we're no longer talking in literary devices and symbolism. You could go back with a camcorder and watch this event happen. Do you make that decision at Genesis 2 and say Adam being created from the dust and Eve being created from his rib? That literally happened in the order that it is written as a narrative. Is it Genesis 3 when they're eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and they're talking to the serpent? Or is it the global flood? Or is it actually not the global flood? Is it the Tower of Babel? Is it actually after the Tower of Babel? Like, is it when you get to Abraham? And there's kind of this perhaps slippery slope where it's like, okay, if you're not going to read the first 11 chapters of Genesis as literal history, if you're not going to read the first chapter of Genesis as literal history, what's preventing you from starting to symbologize and make metaphorical the rest of the Bible? Right? Because at some point we have to say these things literally did happen. Jesus literally lived and died and rose again. Otherwise, we're really veering into some different territory as Christians. So I do think that's a challenge to this view, is you have to come up with an interpretive stance as to, okay, if the first chapter is meant to be read logically rather than chronologically, at what point do you say, now we're looking at real history that you could go back and watch with a camcorder the way it's being described in the text? Okay, here's a summary. The days of Genesis 1 provide a logical framework for how God created rather than a chronological framework. So, we don't actually know how God created the world because that's not what Genesis 1 is about. What do we do with dinosaurs? They existed, just like the fossil record shows us. They did not overlap with humans. That's not, yeah, we don't know how they existed. We have to go to science to find that kind of stuff out. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, go ahead and listen to Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, which we also have on our channel. And then after you listen to it, go hear me and my husband Jonathan talk about it, because I think Galileo's thinking helps navigate some of this conversation and how science and the Bible interact. Okay, so then the question here is, I'm just going to scooch myself down to the corner. There we go. Um, Okay, so then the question really is like, what does the Bible require us to believe about creation? Because all six of these views are not being held by atheists. They are being held by Christians who are seeking to understand the Bible. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, if these are all different views that Christians have held, is it okay? And how should we interact with that? All of them would say the following: God created the world. To be a Christian, like, you have to believe God created the world. The universe has not always existed in some sort of parallel plane to God. We can't believe that something else created God, that something existed before God. Like, as a Christian, we have to say, no, there was a time when God was God and nothing else was, and God created all things, and He is the only eternal thing. That's what the Bible teaches. In the beginning, God created. Because God created everything, the Bible teaches, and we have to believe that He is the supreme authority over all of it. So no matter how He created it and how we're supposed to interpret Genesis 1, like, the moral of the story is God is the king over His creation, and He's the one who gets to create it and then decide how it's all going to play out. He created the world intentionally and with care, and it was good. Like, however you interpret Genesis 1, those are the things that are repeated over and over and over again. And maybe in another video, we'll do a compare and contrast with Enuma Elish and some of the other ancient creation myths, and how clearly, like, Genesis is making this huge contrast to say, like, no, God is not a God of chaos, and the earth is not an accident. Like, God created everything, and then especially human beings, with a purpose, mindfully, and He affirms the goodness of what He creates in the beginning. What else as Christians do we need to say? God gave us the Bible. He also gave us the ability to study the world. And this is where I think Galileo's thoughts are so interesting, right? He gives us science. So we should try and look at both. We have to try and look at both. We can't ignore one or the other as we're trying to navigate how to understand this. And we should do that with humility. Um, Anytime we start thinking we have all the answers and we're the ones who are right and everyone else is wrong, that's a great time to take a step back and check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? Um, our desire should be to understand God and His Word and our world. And so if we're getting into these debates and we're like calling each other, you're outside of the bounds of Christianity or whatever the case is, I don't think that's what Genesis 1 is getting at, and that's not the way God wants us to interact with each other. Okay. So again, I'm not a scientist. I encourage you, if this is a topic of interest for you, go learn some science. Go talk to some science teachers. Go to some museums. Go watch some good scientific YouTube. Go read a book. But that picture over there on the left there, it's just so the Bible is like scaffolding. Okay. And so each of these views, even though they're going to come to different scientific conclusions over how God actually created the world, at the end of the day, they're all using the Bible as that scaffolding to say, whatever we believe, we have to believe these things to keep us in line and in order and in correspondence with who God is and what He's revealed to us. And so wherever you end up on these kinds of views, I want to challenge you and encourage you to have that be your priority. Not so much being right, but being in line as much as you think you can be with God's word. And I think that's possible with any of the views actually that we just went over. So, yeah, I want to thank you for, oh man, if you've watched this whole thing, bless you. Now you know how my students feel. That's why I don't actually like to do a lot of these long talky kind of classes at them. But in any case, thank you for watching, and please comment. I'd love to hear your opinions and perspectives, and like and subscribe for more content like this. Share it with a friend, and come on back for more because we love talking about this sort of stuff. So we hope that it benefits you. And yeah, may God bless you in it.